So, thank you, Daniele, and thank you to the Fondazione Cini for inviting me. So my talk is about pensions and longevity. And typically, well, the first question that one asks about when talking about pensions and longevity is whether pension systems can afford longer lives. So whether they are fiscally sustainable. In this talk, I want to focus on a complementary question, which is whether individuals in retirement can afford their own longer lives. These questions are clearly related, but are clearly also different. And now, pension design is typically based on averages. So when thinking about how to reform a pension system, typically one looks at average life expectancy, average retirement duration, replacement rates, expenditure projections. But individuals do not experience averages. They have their own retirement duration, they have their own pension income, career histories, buffers differ widely across individuals. And the policy challenge I want to focus on is identifying who is exposed to what I call longevity fragility, and whether it is possible to act before it becomes old age hardship. So, longevity fragility, as I define it, is a combination of a long retirement, low pension floor, and limited buffer. This table captures the distinction that I have in mind. On the one hand, there is the question of system sustainability, which focuses, as I said, on aggregate pension expenditure, aggregate contribution, retirement age, and on the other, there is individual preparedness, which focuses instead on pension adequacy, career gaps, household buffers, and longevity risk. And so this distinction brings about two different units of analysis and two different policy levers. So let me start with some data. These data, the data I'm going to show, are from the administrative records of the Italian National Social Security Institute. And all the charts I'll show are based on old age or early retirement retirees from cohorts 1940 to 1950. So it's specific to these 11-year cohorts. And what this graph shows is how many years individuals from this cohort who have died have received their pension. And so the average among the deceased is 14 years. Remember, these are private sector employees aged born between 1940 and 1950. The average is 14 years. But, and this 14 years is the number that is typically looked at to balance the pension system. However, the distribution is quite spread out. 33% received a pension for less than 10 years, and 23 received a pension for more than 20 years. So the same average conceals retirement spells that differ by over a decade. And let me add a complication. Let me add, not a complication, but the living retirees. by 2024, many pension spells had already lasted more than 20 years, and 77% are still open. So, for these individuals, the pension duration will be longer. And this is not a projection. This is something that is already happening. This is something that we know. And the preparedness question is whether the resources that these people have are sufficient to last as long as they will live. And here I distinguish between men and women. So the averages are not only deceptive, but are also selective, because the distribution I showed you earlier is not a random sample of the cohort. Among these cohorts, 28% of men have died so far, but only 16% of women have died. So the missing right tail, which is the long-lived whose final pension duration we do not yet observe, is disproportionately female. So women's longevity is more unobserved, and as I will show you in a few slides, their pension floor is much lower. But before I turn to distribution of gross of pensions, let me highlight the core distinction, which has to do with retirement length and pension. A long retirement with an adequate pension is what I call the prepared longevity, and this is what I would call a success. A long retirement with a low pension is longevity fragility. A caveat. So, before I show the data on pension income, let me make something clear. Pension income is not the whole story. There are savings, housing, there is a family. But pension income, in a sense, is the floor. It is lifelong, and it is regular, and crucially, it is observable in administrative data. So it is what institutions can see, and it is what institutions can act on. And this is why I focus on pension income. So, this is the distribution of the first pension that this cohort, the individuals of these cohorts, 1940 to 1950, have received once they've retired. I want to specify that these are old age pension and early retirement pensions. So there is no survivor pension, there is no invalidity pension, no social benefits. These are pensions that workers receive after they retire. And what we see, that the distribution exhibits an average of just less than 21,000. This is an annual gross pension. However, once again, we have a very spread out distribution. And from the graph, we can see that around 30% entered retirement with a gross pension which is below 12,000 euros a year. Now, this is less than 1,000 a month, but let me say also that this corresponds to around 60% of the median, which is slightly less than the mean in this case. And so 60% of the median is the number that is usually looked at when one thinks of poverty in terms of income typically, but here we are doing it in terms of pensions. And so 30% enter retirement with a pension below this level, and 80% of these are women. And the difference between men and women, let me just say one thing. The spike that you see on the left, around 7,000, is due to the minimum top-up. In Italy, if your pension is below around 650 a month, you receive a top-up to 650 a month for 13 months. And however, to be entitled to this top-up, you need your spouse to have also a low income. So that's the reason why you see something on the left. These are people who didn't receive the top-up despite a very low pension because their spouse has a high or a relatively high income. But, sorry. Okay. Okay. Yes. And here we have the gender dimension. Here we distinguish between men and women. And what we can clearly see from this chart is that women are much more concentrated in the lower tail of the initial pension income distribution, to the point that the third quartile of the women pension income distribution coincides with the first quartile of men's pension income distribution. And as I said, here there are no survivor pension, there are no invalidity or social benefits. These are pensions that people receive after several years of contributions to the system. And so, women, as I said, are concentrated in the lower tail. And what we already know from the previous slides is that women live longer. So we have a longer female longevity that starts with or from a significantly lower pension. And it is just this intersection that creates fragility. And I put the two dimensions together. So we have pension and pension duration. And so here, again, 1940, 1950, retirees, some have died, but some are still living, most are still alive. And what do we see here? What we see is that 57% have received a pension for 20 years or more, and they have an adequate pension. Notice that here I'm not talking about huge pensions. The threshold I have in mind is that 12,000 euros a month. But still, 57% are in this cell. Then we turn to the deceased, and we have that 13% have this adequate pension, but has received a pension for less than 20 years. 5% have received a pension for less than 20 years, but has received a very low pension. Now, this is the group that is at poverty risk. But the group at fragility risk is the group at the bottom right of the table, which is 25% of this cohort, who has received a pension below the low pension threshold and has already received a pension for 20 plus years. Now, just to be precise, this is not a measure of completed poverty. This is an administrative signal of potential exposure. And the question this raises is whether pension systems or pension institutions can use this kind of data to identify these people before hardship appears. Can they do it? What we see here is that the pension observed at retirement is the administrative trace of a working life. What do we have here? We have on the right hand, on the horizontal axis, I created groups by years of contribution, and then the bars identify the share of retirees who are in the fragility cell that I showed earlier. So, fragility is clearly concentrated among the workers with short contribution histories. Among those who contributed to the system for less than 20 years, we have 80% of individuals who are at risk of longevity fragility. And this brings me to the policy slide, to the policy implication. So, pension institutions typically pay pension benefits. However, what I argue is that they can do much more, and given the data that they have, they can inform, which means they can show people pension projections under different longevity scenarios. What if I live 85 years rather than live to 85 years, to 95, to 100? Most people have no idea of what their pension trajectories will look like, because it's true that the pension is regular and constant and lifelong. However, people also live off their savings, and private savings get depleted, household structure change, and health and care needs clearly rise with age. Then they can use this data to identify low preparedness trajectories before retirement. And they can target support where long life meets low resources, which means they can target support to those who are at risk of longevity fragility. And they can do that through credit for interrupted careers, with top-ups, with survival protection, and crucially, through links to long-term care. And let me conclude with 3 takeaways. First, the average retiree is not the policy target. Pension duration and pension income are distributed unequally. Second, longevity fragility is a joint risk. Long retirement becomes fragile when it meets a low pension floor and limited buffers. Third, administrative data can move policy upstream, because pension system can inform, detect, and protect before hardship appears. And the challenge, the real policy challenge, is whether institutions actually do it. I'm done. Thank you.